Rift Valley fever and Nairobi sheep disease. For Rift Valley fever, for the occurrence, it's endemic in Africa and Madagascar. In 2000 and 2001, Saudi Arabia had the first case detected outside of Africa. For the etiology, the Rift Valley fever virus is a part of the Phlebivirus genus, which is a part of Phenuviridae, which is a part of the bunyaviruses. They are single-strand RNA viruses and they have 3 genome segment. They're enveloped and they have low resistance as they are arboviruses. They are zoonotic viruses and they have cross reactions, but they do not have cross protection. For the epidemiology, so the primary vector are mosquitoes, specifically the Aedes family. They're the biological vector and they allow trans-ovarial transmission. There's a risk of this virus spreading to the EU because the albopictus mosquitoes are competent vectors as well. The secondary vectors are the culex, the anopheles, the sandflies, and the biting midges. It's a urixin virus and it causes severe disease in ruminants and humans. It affects sheep, cattle, and wild ruminants, and young calves, puppies, and kittens have 100% mortality. And there is a long-lasting viremia in horses, dogs, and cats. And the resistant animals are rabbits and swine. The reservoir are wild ruminants and humans. Humans are not a dead-end host. It is a lethal zoonotic disease. This virus also has a non-bacterial transmission, so it can be spread through direct contact and airborne infections, and through slaughtering and by having contact with aborted fetuses. It's a very seasonal disease as heavy rainfall allows mosquitoes to replicate, and their cyclical pattern has an outbreak every 5 to 20 years due to the wet seasons in Africa. For the pathogenesis of the disease can be spread through direct contact or through mosquito inoculating the virus into the body. There is a 1 to 2 day incubation period, and then viremia occurs around 4 to 5 days, and then it generalizes and it spreads to everywhere in the body, where it causes endothelial damage in the blood vessels and in the mucosa of the respiratory tract and the intestines. The virus also spreads to the liver and to the fetus, and in the fetus it causes abortion, and the virus replicates in the fetus's liver. It can also spread to the central nervous system. The clinical signs, wild animals can have a 10 to 30% mortality, and livestock has up to a 90% mortality. For the clinical signs in sheep, we can see fever, anorexia and lethargy, icterus and bloody diarrhea, and central nervous system signs, and abortion at any stage of the pregnancy and developmental problems. There can be up to a 90% lethality in less than 1 week. In cattle, they have general clinical signs. They're less severe, but they're similar to sheep, and there's around a 70% lethality in calves, and 100% cases of abortion. In humans, the mortality is less than 1%. It's an influenza-like disease where we can see retinopathy and hemorrhagic fever and encephalitis. The virus can also cause abortion in monkeys, camels, rats, and squirrels. Pathology, we can see hemorrhages of the mucosa of the respiratory and intestinal tract. We can also see liver necrosis, so the liver becomes enlarged and yellow. And we can also see hemorrhagic enteritis. For the diagnosis, we can look at the epidemiology, clinical signs, and post-mortem lesions. And since it's a notifiable disease, you can detect the virus directly using a real-time PCR and indirectly using ELISA. For prevention, in free countries, you need to follow the general epidemiological rules and have mosquito control, and do not import animals from endemic areas. And since humans are the maintaining hosts, human tourism can be a problem. In the case of an outbreak, you need to have movement restrictions and zones restrictions and stamping out. In Africa, in endemic areas, there's an attenuated vaccine and inactivated vaccines. So having vector control, so controlling mosquitoes and have protecting clothing also helps. The next disease is Nairobi sheep fever. It causes hemorrhagic gastroenteritis and abortion in sheep. The occurrence is in the Middle East and East Africa. For the etiology, the Nairobi sheep virus is a part of the orthonairovirus genus, which is a part of Nairoviridae, which is a part of the bunyaviruses. For the epidemiology, the vector is Rhipicephalus sanguis, which is a tick. This disease is spread by ticks, whereas the Rift Valley fever virus is spread by mosquitoes. The host is stenoxin. Sheep are only affected, and local breeds are more resistant. For the pathogenesis, the tick inoculates the virus into the body, and then there's an incubation period and viremia occurs, and then the virus generalizes and spreads all over the body to all the visceral organs. In the clinical signs, we can see fever, anorexia, and lethargy. We can also see icterus and mucopurulent nasal discharge. There is also bloody diarrhea and central nervous system signs, and there's abortion and development problems. All these symptoms can cause shock and death, and there's around a 90% mortality. The main difference in the clinical signs between the Nairobi sheep virus and the Rift Valley fever virus is there's no liver necrosis in Nairobi sheep virus, whereas there is in Rift Valley fever virus. In the pathology, we can expect to see hemorrhages in the mucosa of the respiratory tract and the intestinal tract. We can also see hemorrhagic enteritis and hemorrhages on the lymph nodes and the spleen and the heart. And we can also see nephritis. For the diagnosis, we can look at the epidemiology, clinical signs, and post-mortem lesions. And to detect the virus directly, we do a real-time PCR. And to detect the virus indirectly, we do a ELISA test. And it's a notifiable disease. For prevention, in free countries, we follow the general epidemiological rules, and we also have mosquito control and no imports from endemic regions. In the case of an outbreak, have movement restrictions, zones, and stamping out. There's also a vaccine in endemic areas in Africa. It's an attenuated vaccine, so it's risky. In regard to public health, we can see mild fever and general symptoms.